Hey everyone, in the last couple of videos, we talked about hosting and databases. In this video, we're going to talk about authentication. That is, how do users log into your application? There are three different ways to approach this. We're going to talk about all three, the pros and the cons. If that sounds interesting to you, stick around. Let's go. All right, here's authentication. Before we talk about the three different ways to approach this, I wanted to briefly talk about all of the aspects that go into authentication. It's not just user login, right? This is where you come in and you type in your username and password. But what happens after you press submit? A session's created, usually in a cookie in your browser. Let's say you want to then access the application. Well, you're going to need to send that cookie along with every request to verify that you're logged in, right? And that verification happens on the server in your application. Let's say you want to change your image, your name, your email, update your password. You're going to need user profile management. Or maybe let's say you've logged in with Google or Facebook or GitHub or something. Well, that's a social login. Something to consider. If you're implementing username and password, you're going to need to obviously encrypt that password. You're not going to store it in plain text, right? And then maybe you want to go the extra mile and also implement two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. And of course, if you're the admin of the application and you have some unruly users, user management might be necessary, right? You may want to kick someone out of your application. And then lastly, also if you want to have other applications talk to your application, right? Not just users logging in, but maybe someone can write a plugin or an extension to your app, web app. Well, they're going to need an API key. So all of these aspects of authentication are important, and you need to think about them when choosing a provider and also when designing your application. Maybe you're never going to need an API key, right? Maybe you're never going to use username and password to log in. So those are the kinds of things that you need to think about as we go forward. So let's get started with the first of the three legs of the implementation. All right, so the first thing that we're going to look at is social logins. These are things I'm sure you've seen around. Anywhere you log in, you can log in with like a Google account or a Twitter or Microsoft or Discord, GitHub, SSO, Salesforce. Well, I guess SSO is not a social login, but you can log in with various other services, right? Those are social logins. What happens here is that when you log in with Google, for example, you are authenticating with Google, and Google says, hey, you are who you say you are. And then that identity is then created in your own database as a record. They want you to use their login because they get a lot of data out of that. So social logins, very easy to implement, and documentation is very, very good. So let's take a look at some pros and cons. Okay, we already discussed that it's very easy. One thing that's important also to keep in mind is that whenever you're letting someone else manage something, that's one less thing that you have to manage, right? So specifically in this case, social login, you're letting Google or Microsoft or whoever you're implementing manage the username and password part of the login, right? So that you don't have to worry about encrypting, starting in the database. You don't have to worry about MFA or probably user profile management, unless, I mean, you could probably improve on the social login management part of it. But essentially, you're letting someone else handle that difficult stuff. And do keep in mind that password and 2FA are two of the hardest ones. Oh yeah, by the way, these are color coded. So the yellow are kind of medium difficulty, green are easy, and red are difficult. Gray is nothing. So these two, if you do social logins, this one and this one, they're done for you because Google or Microsoft or Facebook or whoever takes care of them, right? So easy peasy, you don't have to worry about that. Now, one other thing that's a pro too is that users are used to this method. So users are used to logging in with a social provider. It's just easy, right? Log in with Google, wham bam, especially if you're logged in already. It'll just log you into the application. You have to do anything, type in a password or anything. It's very convenient. But there are some cons. Some users may not have a social account, right? All those Linux nerds browsing internet in Vim, like they're not gonna probably have a Facebook account. So if you're logging in with Facebook or Microsoft or something, like if that's your only login, that's your only way to log into your app, you're probably cutting off like some people from your application. And of course, when you're logging in with Google or Microsoft or Facebook, you're getting their branding, right? So you're getting Facebook branding or you're getting Twitter branding or whatever. You can't control the login page look. So it'll be a little bit jarring when you are in your app and then you log in with Google and then you're like kicked out to like the Google login experience. It's a little different, right? So it's not like a huge deal. People are used to it, but it's still a little bit jarring here and there. And usually, social logins are optional. They come along with a different way to log in. So you might have SSO login, or you might have username and password, and then social login on top of that. So that's social login in a nutshell. Pros, cons. I will have this image available in the description of the video, so you can take a look after we go through these. All right, next, let's talk about managed service. Managed service is similar, it's not the same, but it's similar conceptually in that you are not hosting the way to log into your service, your application rather. So someone else is. So there are services that focus on specifically authentication of your application, like Auth0, Clerk, Firebase, Hanko, like Cognito. Like these are services that focus on providing a way to authenticate users. It's their job, it's their business to do that. Whereas social logins are like an afterthought, right? Like when you think of Microsoft, you don't think about social logins. You think about like Microsoft Office or Windows or something, right? So managed services, when you think of Auth0, you think of like, oh yeah, that's a way to log into an app. So managed services give you more than just a way to log in. They give you a way to basically do all of these. Login, session management, user management, profile management. You can also hook up social logins through services like Auth0 or Clerk. Obviously password storage and all this other stuff. So, and also even API keys in some cases. So managed services give you all this stuff out of the box. Let's look at some pros and cons. So usually, especially the bigger providers like Auth0 or Clerk, you can control branding. So you can create your own login experience, and they're pretty powerful. I remember implementing with Auth0, and they had like flows, and you could have a very complicated login flow. So they give you a lot of control, including branding. And the same pro as before is that security is offloaded to someone else. So security, meaning in this case, everything. So not just encrypting and storing passwords, but also managing the session, API keys, and all this other stuff. It's all done by that company for you. And I mentioned this before, but that security is done by corporations who really care about security. It's their job, it's their business, right? If they fail, their whole business like falls apart. So you're in good hands, but those hands are going to cost you. The cost can be insane. And I wanted to touch on the cost because this is something that caught me off guard when I was working with Auth0. all of these services will give you the first 10,000 users are free, and then you pay per 1,000 monthly active users or something like that. And it's, if you think about it, wow, 10,000 users, that's a lot of users. But actually, you can reach that limit fairly quickly if your app becomes popular, right? Like if your app is on Reddit and people love it, or you get featured in some YouTuber's video or something, and suddenly you have like 100,000 users, and you're starting to pay a lot for just login, right? Maybe you're not even ready for that, but you just started paying. So something to keep in mind is that the cost can balloon out of control, especially if you need features. So critical features like a multi-factor authentication are often locked behind pro plans, and things like SSO and stuff like that are going to be locked behind SSO being single sign-on are going to be locked behind enterprise plans, which are even more expensive. So that's just something to keep in mind, is the cost. The cost of these services. It seems like it's cheap to get started, but you're going to get dinged if you grow big. And you don't own your user data, right? So because all of the aforementioned stuff here is managed by the platform, like user management and profile management, all of that stuff is stored on their servers. So you don't actually own that data. It's stored somewhere else. And this could potentially be an issue, especially in Europe, where they want the data to be stored in Europe. So if you're using a provider that doesn't have a database in Europe, potentially an issue. So something to keep in mind. And lastly, some of these providers lack features. So if you want to do, for example, passkey, you have a hardware passkey that you want to implement a login with. Some of these maybe don't have it. So it's just also something to keep in mind as you're determining what kind of login you want to have into your application. Take a look at the platforms and see if the platforms support it. So that is managed service. And lastly, let's take a look at self-hosted. So self-hosted essentially means you build the whole thing. That's really what that means. So if you're building an app in .NET, for example, you're gonna use ASP.NET Identity to create the login flow. Or if you're using Node, you may use Passport. If you're using Express, or you may, if you're using Next, the React Meta framework, you may use Next Auth, or now called Auth.js. Duende and Identity Server. Basically, these are things that you're self-hosting, or maybe Keycloak is another option. So you're going to build your own login, your own authentication, your own user management. Everything you're going to build by yourself. Now, this is obviously the cheapest option in terms of how much money you're spending, because if you are the one building it, you will spend $0 on services because it's free. Now, I should also mention social logins are free, but with pretty serious limitations. So social logins are essentially self-hosted if you only do social logins. But if you're also going to do passkey or magic link or username and password, this is what kind of I'm talking about when I'm talking about self-hosting. So there's a gotcha here, and we're going to discuss these gotchas in the cons section. But let's take a look at the pros first. So first of all, like I already mentioned, 100% free, right? Like you pay nothing. These libraries, like Auth.js, it's free. It's open source. You can just implement it in your app, and you're golden. And because you're building it yourself, you have control over everything. So you are in control. This may seem like not a big deal, but trust me when I say, when you want to build a feature and you need it now, today, because some customer asked for it for authentication, you can just build it. Say a customer wants to log in with, I don't know, some provider you've never heard of, and it's not supported by the other platforms. You can just add it in because you are in control. It's kind of it's a big deal. Let me just put it that way. It's a big deal. So you control everything, the what it looks like, what the flow is like, what the session control is like, right? You may want to store the cookie in the browser and encrypt it, or you may want to store it on the server, the session on the server, or you may want to do both, right? Like you are in control of what you're building. So it's very freeing. The aforementioned Linux Vim nerds, they may want to do this because they are in control. And honestly, there's an appeal to this. Not to Vim, I mean to being in control of everything. And the other pro is that everything is solved. Like encrypting a password, someone did this already. Session management, done. Like all of these aspects here, these are all solved issues, solved problems. So you can just do this yourself because everything is solved already for you. Now, there are some cons, and these need to be taken seriously. You are in control of everything, which also means, first of all, you must write everything. And while this is a con, this con is it's a double-edged con. First, you have to write everything, but that also means that you only write what you need, right? So if you are really just doing email magic link login, that's the only thing that you're gonna write, and it won't take you that long. And it's like you don't have to worry about encrypting a password in your database because people can only log in with their email, right? So if you're only gonna do that, it's not a big deal. But if you're building an app and you're like, I want to do some social logins, username and password, and so on, suddenly it becomes kind of a big deal. So as you write more stuff, you also have to maintain it. So let's say you're doing password encryption in your database, and I don't know, someone finds out that bcrypt has a security flaw or whatever, and you're like, well, now I gotta upgrade my bcrypt package, or I have to stop using this function and use a different function. So this is something to keep in mind, is that we usually as developers don't take into account the maintenance of our code. So we tend to perhaps sometimes write spaghetti code or make it complicated, but the maintenance is very important in the long term for your product. So if you write everything, you must maintain everything. And again, these two are linked, because if you write very little, you have little to maintain, right? Now you also have to secure everything. So basically this has to be flawless, these 2 bullet points. If you're securing everything yourself, you have to make sure first your passwords are encrypted. So you have to learn about password encryption. I'm sure you can just get like AI to tell you how to write it, but you want to verify. You want to make sure that what you're actually doing actually makes sense. So you might have to learn about different aspects of encryption, like initialization vectors and different types of encryption, like AES 256, all this other stuff. You're gonna have to learn about this. You got to make sure that your security, everything's encrypted, nothing is in plain text, everything is stored encrypted at rest, one-way encryption. So there's a lot of learning that goes into creating your authentication system, but pros and cons, right? I put it in the con category, but potentially if you really like learning and you want to learn this kind of stuff, could also be a pro. So it must be flawless. Like you cannot screw up authentication, because if there's a problem, with authentication, your entire business could just collapse. Right? Users could lose, could stop trusting you, and then you're done. Your business is over. So building it yourself is fine if you're like pro at it, or if you become pro at it, or you have a pro build it for you, then it's fine. And then the pro maintain it for you, right? Last thing I wanted to touch on, which is something probably most people don't think about when starting, is that when you go, let's say you strike gold and you become huge and someone wants to buy you out. Well, they're gonna have a guy come and say, Well, this security flow is custom built. So we're going to need to do some certification. Make sure everything is, all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted, right? And that could cost a fair bit of money, take a fair bit of time, and you could fail, right? So you could fail. So you don't have to worry about that with managed services, because someone's going to come and say, oh, they're using Auth0. Well, Auth0 is already certified, so you're good to go. Whereas here, you wrote everything. So you have to answer for any problems that there are. And it's just, let's just say, if you're not worried about, going big, if your app is just like some small thing, some Chrome extension or whatever, that's never going to make it big time, maybe don't worry about it, right? But if you're thinking long term, you're thinking, I'm going to be big, I'm going to be huge app, then this is something you should consider. So there you have it. We have the 3 different ways to approach authentication, all the things you have to worry about when looking at authentication. I will have an image in the description of the video. And next, we're going to take a look at file storage. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in file storage. Take care.